Good morning and welcome to the Point. To say that it was an active week in politics would be an understatement. Presidential politics is coming a little bit more in focus. Plus, we had a big event in Grand Rapids with the grand reopening of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Museum. We'll touch on both of those things later in this morning's program, but let's start in Lansing, where the legislature has wrapped up business at least for this part of the year. There are a number of things that they still need to get done, but they did deal with some of the bigger issues that needed to be done before they left for the summer. One of those including Detroit Public Schools. It was a deal that puts more than $600 million into the schools. It didn't suit everyone, and it didn't suit hardly anyone who is involved with that particular process, but it passed the House and Senate nonetheless. Another big issue that they're talking about in Lansing, and that they took action on, at least in the Senate, is criminal justice reform. And when you hear that, some people get a number of different ideas. One of the architects of that plan is Senator John Prose. He talked to us about what he means when it comes to criminal justice reform. Senator, criminal justice reform, when you hear that phrase, some people automatically recoil and say, well, you're going to be soft on crime, soft on criminals. But this has a big economic impact. First of all, let's go back to the beginning. Where did the impetus from this begin? Because I've heard about criminal justice reform in this state for a decade and a half.
Well, it started for me initially by being appointed to the corrections budget. And then in the Senate, chairing the corrections budget. That was during my time in the House of Representatives, in the minority. And then now spending time in the majority as the chair of the corrections and judiciary budgets. I've been able to see the threads that are drawing the two pieces together, and really the economic impact that that has on our communities because of crime. Crime in our communities has an untold impact. Obviously victims who then bear the brunt of those crimes themselves and the pain from those crimes. Our communities, because of law enforcement costs, court costs, the cost to society overall is so significant. And then as the chair of the corrections budget, if they end up in prison, we end up paying general fund dollars. So what does that mean? General fund dollars are those dollars that are discretionary, that if spent wisely can be spent someplace else. If we do well in our corrections budget, we can spend it someplace else. Now, that's the green eye shade view. That's the one way to look at it. And it's very important because if we can spend it on infrastructure or roads, if we can spend it on water, we know that's been a big topic in the last 6 months, 8 months. If we can spend it on education, higher education for our kids to keep them in Michigan, those are all really areas that we can benefit from if we have smart criminal justice investment. So the first view is really a penny pinching sort of view and do the best with the taxpayer dollars that come to Lansing. The second portion of that is looking at really how to rehabilitate people, because that is going to be a successful benefit to the future. Less cost in our communities, less crime, fewer victims.
By the time we get done with this conversation and it airs in its entirety, a number of these things, including part of the criminal justice reform, more money for Detroit Public Schools, a lot of these things go hand in hand. The lack of investment or inadequate investment, if you see it that way, in early childhood and K through 12 education sometimes is linked directly to incarceration and a much higher expense later on. So the economic part of this really does all tie together. You were talking about the threads. But as I said at the outset, what does that look like? We like saving money, but people are out there right now saying, but I don't want to see dangerous folks let out on the street in the name of saving money.
And that's the very first thing that the Department of Corrections responsibility is. Law enforcement, who should be praised for the work that they're doing. Corrections is doing a very good job in Michigan, decreasing the number of prisoners that we have today, and presumably giving them the best benefit to no longer be in our prison system and be successful in our communities. We know that criminal justice timeline, that spectrum, runs all the way from our juvenile justice side of the equation right on through towards post-parole and post-parole employment, hopefully. So that entire spectrum, if you can divert somebody off of that life of crime at any point in time, work with our problem-solving courts, which we are seeing tremendous success in actually trying to address some of the underlying concerns and problems that our criminals are exhibiting. If we can divert them at any point in time, particularly in the juvenile space, away from that life of crime, we end up with exponential benefit down the line. And it really is, on the one hand, it's the financially right thing to do for reinvestment, and on the other hand, it's also the right thing to do for individuals who really need that kind of support and assistance. I think what's really interesting about the debate that we have seen, and really my own understanding, quite frankly, is that all of the different departments of state at some point deal with crime and crime victims, criminals and their criminal activity, and the underlying problems and concerns. Department of Health and Human Services budget, which of course is a combination of Department of Health or Department of Human Services and Department of Community Health. The corrections budget, the judiciary budget, the general government budget when it comes to contributions to our local law enforcement. All of these budgets have something to say about that life cycle of crime in our communities. How we work to divert people is how we will show success.
There are a number of different bullet points that you have offered in this legislation. One of the first ones is taking a look at those people, and correct me if I'm wrong, I read it to mean people who are in long-term incarceration, who have reached a certain age, have certain health problems, and have certain reasoning that they maybe don't need to be incarcerated anymore. That was, as I read it, that was part of the plan.
So and there's 25 bills in total will be in the package between the House and the Senate, and I need to point out, Republicans and Democrats, House and Senate members are all pulling those string in the same direction, trying to find solutions to some of these reform ideas that will give us a better chance at changing that spectrum of crime and costs. So what we see is on the area of some of our oldest and most infirmed individuals is that the commutation process that currently exists for the governor to commute sentences is a very lengthy process, sometimes 450 days for somebody who may be dying, and the governor is petitioned to allow them to be commuted for their benefit of dying someplace other than in our prison system, which is very costly and expensive, as you can imagine. Just like on the Medicare side of things, the majority of our costs come in the end-of-life concerns and problems. Knowing that that's the case, one of the bills in the package talks about decreasing the commutation time to about 90 days so that the proper information can be given to victims, that we value victims in the process, and that the governor takes the responsibility that he or she, whomever is governor, would have the ability to speed up that commutation process if that's the right thing to do. But you have to make sure that law enforcement, our local communities, and in particular the victims, know that this is the process that is going on so that there's a transparent understanding of what crime and punishment means in Michigan.
What does that mean for that prisoner then, just not playing devil's advocate, but just looking at the harsh reality? If you are a prisoner who is old, infirm, or as you say in the final stages of life, and you are in the state corrections facility, it is the state's responsibility.
That's right.
If that sentence is commuted, do those people go immediately to Medicaid? Because they obviously are going to be indigent for the most part. They're not going to have dollars and cents to take care of those health expenses, final burial expenses, and all of that.
That is exactly what would happen. And really the debate on commutation versus medical parole stems from the discussion of whether or not we have truth in sentencing remaining at the core of what we do, and then Medicare, or Medicaid, in this case it'd be Medicaid, would then step in if in fact they were no longer within the walls of the prison or considered a prisoner of the state of Michigan. That seems to be the mark that is the demarcation point between federal support and not federal support for the kind of healthcare consequences of somebody in their final stages of life.
Now, when you talk about commuting sentences, again, you're talking about people who are well past the position of committing more crimes, or at least that would be the supposition.
Yeah.
But there's some people that are going to hear about corrections or criminal justice reform, and they're going to say, "Oh, wait a minute! Now you're going soft on crime." Is there any change in these 25, 19, 19, I think, over in the Senate? Is there any change in sentencing guidelines contained within this package of bills?
There isn't. We didn't specifically go about the business of identifying specific crimes that we would change the structure or the length of the sentences themselves. As you know, in Michigan, we have the grid that gives advisory now. Court cases have gone on. It's now advisory for the sentence guidelines themselves. So a judge imposes a sentence based upon some advisory language or some advisory sort of guidance as to how to sentence an individual. In Michigan, the goal and objective that we've had in this package, though, is to identify how we are going to instead help to decrease the number of people who are participating in the criminal justice system in the first place. So almost all of these bills focus on the front door and the back door of our prison system. By that I mean the revolving door of individuals. So to put it into context, we have about 100,000 people that are currently under supervision in the state of Michigan by the Department of Corrections. About 42,200 approximately are in our prison system walls themselves. The rest are either on probation or parole. Of that number, our prison population is made up of 50% failures on probation and parole. So if 50% of the people that we already know who they are, where they live, what their problems are failing and ending up through technical violations or committing new crimes in our community in our prison system, we're starting to address that concern. Focus instead on what is it that we're doing to make sure that the prison system works effectively, that our corrections, probation, and parole officers who do great work can have an even better chance at success and decreasing crime. This isn't at all about soft on crime. Instead, it's what are we going to do to reform the way that we do work today so that we can decrease crime overall and make sure that punishment is still at the center of what happens in our society. It is necessary that folks understand crime and punishment still exist. How can we decrease the crime so that punishment isn't as necessary?
It's a big conversation when you start talking about incarceration and justice and reform. But Senator Prose will come back and talk more about his plan when we come back to the point. Welcome back to the Point. This morning we're talking with Senator John Prose about criminal justice reform. It is one of the many issues the legislature is dealing with. It's one that the Senate passed out before they left for their summer break. He further explains his plan. Earlier, you spoke about, I believe you called them specialty courts, and I assume you're talking about veterans courts, drug courts,
Absolutely.
and that type of thing. Explain to folks at home, because many people are not aware of those. The vast majority of people are never involved in the judicial system, so
That's
they
right.
may not be aware that those exist. But for example, in Muskegon County, there's a very good example of a veterans court that deals with veterans who may be in very specific situations because of their service or whatever, that they can be dealt with and diverted rather than going into circuit court and going to either county jail
Right.
or going to prison.
That's exactly right. So our problem-solving courts, and again, this is the uniqueness, that unique situation that I have as the chair of Judiciary Budget also, is the incredible investment we've made in recent years in our specialty courts, our problem-solving courts, like you mentioned, the Veterans Court, swift and sure sanctioning courts. And the idea behind it is that the judge acts not just as judge, but as a member of a team that works on the counseling needs of an individual. And they're very unique, of course, counseling needs for veterans. Oftentimes PTSD and drug and alcohol addiction are underlying concerns that are exhibited as part of the problems from PTSD. Knowing that those connections exist and the judge taking action to ensure that he has the right individuals or she has the right sort of counselors on board to assist that individual gives a better chance at success. The other way to look at it is like a swift and sure sanctioning court. Folks who commit crime in our communities and cause victimization in our communities and cost to our communities oftentimes don't see swift justice. By that I mean they may commit a crime, see the judge for a preliminary hearing, and then 2 months later, 3 months later, it's adjudicated or worked through the process. By then, that individual has completely forgotten perhaps what has happened, may have no idea what is going on, may still have drug and alcohol addictions as the underlying problems that caused the larceny or whatever it was that was committed as a crime. The two don't meet in terms of crime and punishment. So I have a 14, 13, and 9-year-old children at home. All three, we've made clear that actions have consequences. And there's swift action for consequences that are taken, right? So if you fail in the expectations, there's an immediate reaction. Swift and sure sanctioning court makes it very clear, and the offender signs the paper that says if I have a dirty drop, meaning that I've failed a drug test, and I'll be drug tested a lot, as often as my agent wants to drug test me, I will go immediately before the judge, and immediately the judge takes action based upon the following sanctions that I signed the piece of paper. There's a connection between action and responsibility, action and consequences, and the judge may say, I don't care that you've got a party tonight for your daughter's birthday. You're in jail tonight. You're in jail tonight because the sanction says so. You chose last night to smoke weed, to do something that you should not have done according to my rules. You have a consequence for that. That is showing significant success to the tune of 35% reduction in recidivism because it's making a connection between actions and consequences. That's problem-solving courts at its best.
There's a lot more to this, but there's one other area I want to talk about, and there is a provision that would allow some type of incentive for employers who are willing
Yes.
to take people who are on probation or who have gotten out of prison or out of jail and trying to help them find meaningful employment. Because I think anecdotally, and you probably have better solid facts, I think everybody can identify with the idea that if you can't find employment, if you can't find a way to make a living to support yourself or your family or whomever, and if you've already been in trouble with the law, there's a significant chance that you may get in trouble with the law again if you can't find a way to make a living. I mean, that's kind of a basic need. And so this bill provides some help for that. Two questions: how would it work,
Right.
and how would you pay for it?
So, two very specific things on that. The job, that job, is the most critical factor of success. Any one of our parole and probation officers will tell you that. It gives the level best chance for an individual to succeed, both on the front door if they're probationers who are exhibiting problems in our communities, committing crimes, and parolees having already been inside our walls. And Director Washington, the director of the Department of Corrections in Michigan, recognizes this concern too. So she's instituting a very, very creative, groundbreaking sort of scenario where she is developing what is called a CTE village, Career and Technical Education Village, which is a full-blown workday inside the walls with training, with equipment, with manufacturing technologies inside the walls, giving those individuals the best chance to succeed outside the walls. And then we're also, with the effort with the budget that we have put together, insisting that the director recognize in our prosperity regions which jobs are available, so that we're not just simply training folks without a connectivity to the communities that they're going to go home to. And for your listeners to understand, your viewers to understand, we turn over the prison population every 3 to 3.5 years. So most everybody who goes to prison is going to come home. How do we make sure that they succeed? That's where this job scenario comes in. And one of the bills says that our job creators, our job providers out there, may be unwilling to take a risk. Maybe we can give them a financial incentive, a grant that would help to offset some of the costs that they associate with risk. If we can do that, and by the way, West Michigan leads the way in working with the Department of Corrections to identify individuals to come into the workplace, to try to give them a job. And in some ways it's a part of our ethos. It's a part of our ethos to want to try to help our fellow man be successful, particularly those that have been imprisoned. So knowing that that's working in many ways in West Michigan, we're trying to replicate that with some incentives. It would be through the technology and, from the Talent and Education Department. The economic development is important through TED, and that TED department would have grants available in the savings that we found in this budget. Now, how do we find savings? The department should be praised for decreasing the prison population. We were closing a facility. Difficult for the Traverse City area to lose a facility and the 230 plus jobs. But that equals $22 million in savings in the general fund that we can reinvest in areas like this, innovative ideas that hopefully increase the pace at which we decrease the prison population.
So that's part of what the Senate did get done before they left for a break. Some of the things that remain undone: energy policy. It's another interest of Senator Prose and Senator Mike Knopf's. They're still working on a plan that will help guide Michigan's usage and production going into the future. Auto no fault is something that they'll be looking at over in the House after the Senate passed a somewhat different version to send back to them. And medical marijuana use. There's something that was on the docket but didn't quite get the votes. So what happens when they come back this fall? We'll be watching very closely. And of course, part of that will depend on a big upcoming election. Another note about the election in a moment when we come back to the point. Welcome back to The Point. Well, this week there was a turning point in Decision 2016. Hillary Rodham Clinton got enough delegates to be considered the presumptive Democratic nominee, at least according to most people who were counting delegates. There are still some folks in the Sanders campaign who say not so fast, and Sanders himself says that he'll continue to take his message all the way to the convention. But that doesn't mean necessarily that he'll continue to campaign all the way to the convention. It's something we'll be watching very closely because we too will be in Philadelphia right after we leave Cleveland, covering both the Republican and Democratic nominees. Now it appears to be Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump heading into November. You'll see it all right here on To The Point. And there was some presidential politics of another kind, this time going back. It was more than 3 decades ago when the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Museum first opened. This week, there was a grand reopening, and there are a lot of new things to see. 35 years after it opened, the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Museum has a brand new look with all the new bells and technological whistles that a $15 million renovation can buy. The look is new and fresh, but the message is the same as it has always been and always was for President and Mrs. Ford.
We had a great leader in Jerry Ford. He was willing to make tough decisions, some of which cost him dearly politically, but he did it because it was the right thing to do.
Dick Cheney is most recently remembered for being vice president for George W. Bush, but before that, he worked in the Ford administration and attributes his subsequent career largely to his early relationship with President Ford.
It fundamentally changed my life after I worked for him while he was president. Then I went back home to Wyoming and ran for Congress. He was the inspiration for that.
Okay.
Later on to defense, vice president, and so forth. And none of that would have happened without the time I spent working for Jerry Ford back in the 1970s.
Nearly 3 generations removed, an 18-year-old author headed to college this fall echoed the principles held by a president who had been out of office 20 years before she was born.
It is this generosity, humility, and sense of civic duty that individuals recognized in President Ford. And it is what made him, and makes his family still today, so special in the heart of every life they have touched.
Juliet Turner is an author and national director for Constituting America, who spoke during the rededication that was largely aimed at a young audience in attendance. And the big celebration wasn't just about the rededication of the museum. It was also about a new dedication for an 8,000 square foot learning center where people will be able to learn about public service and integrity, all at the Ford Museum. Think of it as a hands-on experience that transports you back through time. That's what the new Ford Museum feels and looks like.
It's not just history. Understanding the history is critical and important because it helps us with the knowledge that's necessary. But as Juliet said, it's about our future. You're our future.
Doug DeVos says the new 8,000 square foot learning center that bears his family's name will help preserve the leadership model set by President Ford.
Because the principles he used to lead and the way he stuck to those principles in tough times. And so to have a place where we can study and learn about that, not just from a historical perspective, but to think about how they apply to our lives and how they apply to our future, that's really the purpose of what this is all about.
A young author and national director for Constituting America, Juliet Turner, spoke directly to the hundreds of students in the audience.
Just because we are young, just because we do not hold elected office, just because we do not yet hold college diplomas in our hands does not mean that we cannot make a difference in the lives of our families, our friends, our community, and our country. We are the future of America.
The museum is open daily. You've got to go in and take a look at some of those new interactive displays where you can dig deeper into history and actually look at other archives that aren't on display, but you can access them through some of those displays. It's all at the Ford Museum in downtown Grand Rapids. So what's ahead? Well, the legislature, as we talked about here in Lansing, will be out for a while, but there'll still be some issues to be talked about. Presidential politics will only heat up between now and those big conventions coming up in July. And of course, we'll be following that all the way into November. And I hope you will follow us every Sunday morning at 10 o'clock right here on Wood TV 8 for To The Point.